So one of the main treatments I want to talk about, because it's probably the most advanced of any of these techniques, is a thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation. That's a real mouthful, so I'm just going to call it TMS. But TMS is a really, it's basically a trick. It's a trick to get activity into the brain. What TMS involves, I'll get you to go one forward for me. What TMS involves, it involves a coil that has an electrical current passes through that coil. Whenever we have electricity passing through anything, it generates a magnetic field. Okay? Magnetic fields pass through us without any resistance. There's magnetic fields generated by the power lines, by the computer screen, etc., obviously fairly weak. But magnetic fields pass through us. There's no resistance to magnetic fields passing into our brain. And what this coil does, it generates an electrical current is switched on very quickly through the coil. It generates a magnetic field. That magnetic field is, because of the shape of the coil we use, which looks like this sort of figure of 8, it generates a quite focused magnetic field that can pass several centimetres into the brain. And when you apply, just like the electricity can generate a magnetic field, if you apply a magnetic field to something that conducts electricity, you can actually induce an electrical current. And so when this magnetic field is applied to the brain, our brain is full of things that conduct electricity, the nerve cells in our brain. So it starts to get electricity flowing in some of those nerve cells. It actually makes them fire. So if we put one of these coils on the area of my brain that controls, say, the muscles in my hand, and I turn it up enough, it actually starts to make that area of my brain fire, and my muscles will start to twitch. Like if I really turn it up, it'll start off with my hand, and then it'll make my arm and maybe the whole side of my body twitch. If I put it on the area of the brain that's involved in vision, I'll see flashes of light, for example. So it can make those nerve cells fire. And if you make nerve cells fire repeatedly, it changes their activity. That's how we learn things. If you try to learn something, you repeatedly try to put it in your brain, there are nerve cells in your brain repeatedly being exposed to something, eventually it starts to get coded in your brain. Your brain, those nerve cells change their activity and they remember it. So if we make a bunch of nerve cells fire repeatedly with this magnetic stimulus, those nerve cells eventually change their activity. And fortunately, the brain kind of works in a nice way for us. There's one way we can increase brain activity, and there's actually one way with TMS that we can decrease brain activity. So it gives us a nice tool to try to make changes in people's brains in a way that might have some therapeutic value. Let's get you to go back one slide for a second. So this machine was the machine we kind of started off with when we started this research about 10 years ago. Each of these little boxes down the bottom had to be wired up to an individual power point. And even when we ran it, it would make the lights up and down the corridor flash because the machine was actually so inefficient at actually producing these electrical currents. A very clever guy thought of the idea of TMS over 100 years ago, but it took until the mid-1980s that they could actually build a machine even capable of producing a basic magnetic field strong enough to produce brain activity. This machine is a machine manufactured by a company called Neuronetics. This is actually now a licensed and sold device in the US for the treatment of depression. We'll come back and talk about it at the moment, but it obviously looks a lot nicer than this. It has fancy seats and touch screens and so forth. And this is now in about 250 clinics around the US being used for the treatment of depression. And it was in depression that the focus of research with TMS really started. It started back in the mid-1990s. People started in a really basic way, just putting the coils on people's brains and stimulating their brains and seeing what would happen, and nothing really did happen of value. But it happened to be the same time when brain scanners that could take pictures of what was going on in the brain, started to become available. And in the very, very first brain scanning studies in depression, what happened was people were put in a brain scanner and they were told to just lie there at rest, and people took pictures of their brains and they compared people with depression and people who weren't depressed. And what they found was there was an area of the brain at the front that wasn't as active, it just didn't light up as much when people were depressed. So researchers said, well, we've got a target now. Let's try to stimulate this area of the brain with TMS, see if we can make it more active and see if that helps people's depression. And it did. They started off with very short studies because everyone was worried about safety at first. They started off just treating for a week, and that worked, and so they extended to 2 weeks and 3 weeks. And now we would sometimes treat people for even longer than that. But this stimulation to this particular area of the brain seems to produce an improvement in people's depression. And over time, the trials have been done in a much more substantial way. There've been, I think it's about 35 different trials now evaluating this type of TMS. It seems to work fairly effectively. There's been research comparing TMS directly to electroconvulsive therapy that again show its effectiveness. And there's been an increasing understanding that we don't have to just target one area of the brain. There are a variety of different ways that we can actually use TMS to treat people with depression. This is just an example of the sorts of brain scans we were talking about. You have to use a bit of eye of faith here, but if you look carefully enough, you can see that on the left, these are kind of reversed. This is the left and the right. There's not as much redness on the left side of this brain as there is on the right side of the brain. And then after this person's had a course of treatment, it sort of evened up. We've got an increase back into this part of the brain. This blood flow's been restored, the activity's restored, and that's corresponded to the improvement in the person's depression. Over time, over the 15 or so years that we've been doing this sort of research, we've fortunately been able to come to the conclusion that this sort of treatment's pretty safe. The one theoretical risk of it is if we're making the brain more active, if we overdo it, we can actually cause a fit or a seizure, like somebody with epilepsy would have. But fortunately, some researchers back over 10 years ago now were kind of smart enough to work out what was safe and how hard you could sort of push things. And so that really isn't a major problem when we treat people now. It can cause a bit of a headache. The magnetic field just goes into your brain without resistance, but it does cause twitching of the scalp muscles, which kind of feels a bit like a little woodpecker sitting there banging on your head. Woodpecker is probably about the best analogy people describe. Most people find it reasonably comfortable. We actually have people fall asleep during treatment, but it can be uncomfortable sometimes or give a bit of a headache. But what we haven't found, really fortunately, is there's no sense of any problems with memory or thinking. And we were really worried about this at first because ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, can cause some memory problems. But we don't see that at all with TMS. And what we see is people's memory and their thinking actually improves as their depression gets better rather than it going in the other direction. And along with a whole lot of other research that's gone off on in other fields, we've come to, we've been reasonably reassured that the type of magnetic fields we use are not causing any deleterious brain changes. They don't cause changes to the cells or to the DNA or anything like that. So it seems to be a fairly safe and well-tolerated treatment. You can keep going. I'll skip through that slide. This just shows an example of one of the studies that we did. These numbers here just reflect the severity of somebody's depression. So we get patients they get interviewed and they've got a particular way of scoring the severity of the depression. And over a number of weeks, some people had active treatment, a real type of TMS, and some had a placebo. And as you can see, the depression scores, the severity of their depression improved dramatically over time. By 2 weeks, they were already looking much better than the people who had the placebo. And by 6 weeks, they were really dramatically different. And in this particular trial, about half of the people who had the active treatment actually got completely better. And that's what really matters the most. Not that we can statistically show differences, but what matters is the number of people whose actual depression goes away and can actually get back on with their lives, which is obviously really, really critical. So TMS was approved in the United States in 2008. There was a large study done that we participated in by a company in the US. It's taken a long time to get to that because the idea of TMS was dreamed up in the 1890s. People couldn't patent it. It was an old idea, and so there wasn't the same weight of financial gain to be made in doing this sort of research. So of all the studies that were done, they were all done by individual researchers rather than by some big company coming along and putting a whole lot of money into the research. But probably luckily, a company in the US managed to come up with a new way of making a coil, so they were able to patent that and get venture capital investors. They got a whole lot of investors who were running away from the tech bubble when all the sort of technology internet companies went bust. And they were able to fund a big study around the world which proved that TMS worked in the way that the regulatory authorities like treatments to be assessed. And they were able to use that to get approval in the US. And as I said, it's now becoming fairly widely available. It's not fully approved in Australia, mainly because the companies haven't come and gone through some of those same regulatory hurdles in Australia. But we're now using TMS in a number of hospitals around the country, both in Melbourne and also interstate. And that provides benefit to quite a lot of patients. These tend to be patients who have tried an antidepressant medication, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 medications, and are not getting better, and who then come in for this particular treatment. But we still need to do more work on this, particularly how to maintain people's wellness over time. People's depression gets better, they go home, they want to get on with their lives, but sometimes it will come back again. And so we're now particularly focused on how we can use the TMS to stop the depression coming back, so people can really have long periods of wellness. That's really, really important for us. But also this, trying to be able to predict up front who's going to respond to a treatment or who's not going to respond to a treatment. Across psychiatry in the next, I think, 10 to 15 years, there's really going to be a lot of emphasis on the so-called personalisation of treatment. Instead of somebody coming along with schizophrenia or depression and getting just the first drug that the doctor's used to prescribing, there's going to be an increasing emphasis on trying to develop ways of saying, how can we test what's going on in your brain or your genes or your blood in a way that allows us to select our treatment much more specifically? That might be choosing one drug over another drug. It might be in choosing TMS over a medication. It might be choosing a different type of psychotherapy or counselling over another type of psychotherapy. There's a lot of acceptance that we need to go down that path. Partly because, as I said before, schizophrenia is not one disorder. Depression is probably not one disorder. And we need to individualise things. There are probably genetic clues. There appear to be some genetic tests that may predict response to different sorts of treatments. We think there's ways of measuring brain activity with scanning and even with just measuring electrical activity from the brain that will allow us to choose treatments better. There are already some progress in that regard, and we think we're going to be able to get further and further down that track. But particularly treatments like this that involve people coming into a clinic and having unusual things done to them, which might be frightening and anxiety-provoking. It would be nice to say to somebody, look, we'll do this blood test, and if you're in a certain category, your chances of responding are this high, or no, maybe you should try something else. So we really want to put some emphasis on that.